Howdy all, Wyrm here. So the FF14 community for the past while has been abuzz with speculation of what the new job is going to be in the next expansion, or if we're even going to get one. Now, I wanted to actually use this as a test bed as well for me doing a kind of pseudo podcast sort of video without a script, because I've noticed with scripts I tend to be, well, for lack of a better word, a robot. So I wanted to try and go through all the jobs that I think may or may not actually be a job that would be eligible to be added to FF14. So, enough about me, let's get started. So, the first one is the Beastmaster. Now, the Beastmaster is a job that is known in the Final Fantasy series. It's been in some of the mainstream games, but it's been in a lot of the non-mainstream ones of the Final Fantasy series. Now, Beastmaster generally is a class set around taming pets and using pets in battle. However, it's not really been tested in the MMO series other than Final Fantasy XI, but Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV are night and day. Like, they're totally different games, so they work completely differently. In terms of how it would work in Final Fantasy XIV, I don't think it would work that well now, to be honest. Now, the primary reason I say that is because just the game in general just doesn't actually support it that well. I mean, we do have pets in the game, but they're fairly limited. So I can't really see it being added other than anything than a limited job. It would actually make a rather interesting limited job if it could tame pets in the environment. Because we've seen the Blue Mage right now, it's just it takes the abilities, so we'd actually just be taking the monsters instead. Would it be added? It's a distinct possibility. Next we have the Berserker job. Now, I've actually brought this up in another video I uploaded a few days ago. The Berserker, we actually first saw it in the Hero's Gauntlet dungeon. So we saw a bit of what it would and wouldn't be like if it was ever added into Final Fantasy XIV. Now, I've already speculated as to whether or not this thing would be added or not, and my theory is definitely not. Now, the primary reason I say that is because most of its toolkit, abilities, backstory and everything else is already in the warrior job. So there's really not a place for Berserker at this time. Now, this brings up a very good point, that Final Fantasy XIV's jobs, they had to be modified a lot in order to work in an MMO format. They were designed around a turn-based combat system, so they wouldn't work in an MMO unless they were intensively modified. So as a result, the jobs that we have at the moment are usually mixes of multiple jobs of the Final Fantasy series. So the warrior that we have in FF14 is a mixture between the warrior, the berserker, and I'd say the knight as well, in some ways. So you'd see stuff like that, but it's as a result of that, the berserker doesn't really have a place in Final Fantasy XIV. So next up we have the most likely category for a job to be added in either the next expansion coming up or an expansion in the future. The Chemist or the Apothecary. Now, the Final Fantasy community has been abuzz with about the new healer job incoming, and the Chemist fits mainly because it's the only one left that you could really add. We've already got the Astral Logician, which is kind of a new creation for FF14, and then we have the Scholar and the White Mage, which are the other main healers. Now, the Scholar and the White Mage and the Astral Logician, they take elements not only from their main jobs, which are already staples in the Final Fantasy series, but they take a lot of elements from the other jobs as well. So the Chemist is really the only one left. It focuses around pots, items, mixing items for beneficial effects. Like an example is Riku in Final Fantasy X. She mixes items together for different effects. The Chemists, it's speculated to be like that, but I'm assuming it's going to be skills that are just based around items rather than just using items themselves. Although using items would be rather interesting. It would give us an excuse to use all those pots that we end up just throwing away all the time. But in terms of whether or not it's going to be added, I think it's very likely. The community has just been constantly abuzz about it. I'm sure Square Enix has taken notice. Naoki Yoshida has probably already heard, oh, they all think Chemist is going to be the next one. Why don't we just make it the next one? So, is it likely? I think yes. I think Chemist is going to be the next healer. It mightn't be called Chemist. It could be called Apothecary. It could be called something else entirely. We don't know. So next we have the Geomancer. Now the Geomancer is not a new job to the Final Fantasy series. As you can see, it's appeared in most of the mainstream games and some of the offshoots as well. Now it focuses around using the terrain and planet energy for attacks and spells and stuff like that. Its toolkit, unfortunately, is all pretty much in the Astral Edition. The Astral Edition and the Geomancer are pretty much the same thing. Their lore and how they use their power is just a little different. Now, I don't see the Geomancer being added, mainly because most of its toolkit and most of its overall how it works went into the development and implementation of the Astral Edition. Now, the Gunner is the next one. So, the Gunner is a class that's appeared... It doesn't really have a name in these games, but it's appeared in most of the mainstream games from the PlayStation onwards. Now, it revolves around just mainly using your gun as the main weapon and using abilities and skills revolving around the gun entirely. So it's like a machinist in a way, although the machinist is mainly aimed towards... It's a bit about the gun, but it's more about the machinery and the turrets and the mechs and stuff like that. So the Gunner is a little different. Like, we've seen them in Final Fantasy XIV. It's mainly the NPCs though. So the leader of Limsa Laminsa, I can't pronounce her name, so I'm not even going to try. But she could be classified as a gunner because everything revolves around her gun. And if you've seen, for example, if you ever went to the Marauders Guild, you'd see that there's a Marauders Guild and then there's a icon for a gun as well. And we always speculated gunner was going to be added as a result. Could it be added? Honestly, I don't know. Because a lot of its toolkit, as I said... Toolkits have gone into developing the classes that we have for 14, so a lot of the Gunner toolkit went into the development of the Machinist class. But it's possible the Gunner could be added as a new job that is range DPS that is focused solely around the gun. So gun skills, gun abilities, it could be like... It could be anything really, but it's possible that the Gunner could be a job that could be added because there is a location for it. We don't have a fourth ranged yet, but this could be it. Now the next one is a rather obscure one unless you've played some of the Tactics games, for example. It's called the Mystic Knight or just the Magic Knight. Now this combines black magic and swordplay, so like imbuing your weapons with magic in order to deal damage and use different attributes on your weapon, for example. If you play Final Fantasy IX, you know the way Steiner and Vivi actually combine together, so Steiner's weapon gets imbued with Vivi's magic when he's in the party. It's stuff like that. So that's a Magic Knight. Now, you're probably already thinking the Red Mage is already there. Yes and no. The Red Mage really revolves around using white and black magic. That's its main niche, although it uses a sword. It doesn't imbue its weapon with it though. So this would be rather unique, but is there a place for it? I don't really know, mainly because of the fact that attributes are not really a thing in Final Fantasy XIV anymore, and the Mystic Knight has always revolved around the manipulation of attributes in order to get an advantage in combat. So using water against fire, for example, fire against ice, etc, etc, earth against lightning, for example. So we don't have that anymore in Final Fantasy XIV. It was a thing in A Realm Reborn, at least a little bit, but we don't have it anymore. So the Mystic Knight is doesn't really have a place in Final Fantasy XIV anymore. Now the Mime is a rather interesting one. It's always been an interesting job that you'd see in a couple of the mainstream games. Now it primarily revolves around copying abilities of allies, for example. So if an ally uses an ability, then you can use Mime in order to use that job. I think that's how it worked in Final Fantasy VI anyway. Now, because of that, it's rather niche. So I'm not really sure if it would work in an MMO format outside of a group. So I don't even know how its solo would work. But I'll be drawing inspiration from Final Fantasy, or Dissidia Final Fantasy rather, in the fact that Bart has the Mime ability that just allows him to use the weapons and abilities of the other heroes that you have in Dissidia. So Bart's worked rather well in Dissidia, so it's possible that you could have a job that just uses mainstream abilities from all of the other jobs. So it's like the Bruce Lee, pretty much, taking the best of every martial art and making his own martial art. and then just using it to the best ability. That's how Bruce Lee became so great. He just took the best from every martial art and then used it. That's what the mime is. It could be just a job that takes the best from every job and then uses it in a job of its own called the mime. Could it be added? It might make an interesting limited job, but just mainly from what I'm thinking about, I don't think it works in an MMO. Not yet. Not in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, the Necromancer job is a job that we've seldom seen in the Final Fantasy series, although it does exist, but it's mostly the enemies we face are Necromancers rather than playable. The Necromancer revolves around the animation of undead and using caster spells, so it's essentially a magic caster that revolves around undead reanimation. It would be a very interesting caster, but the main reason I think that the Necromancer could be added to Final Fantasy XIV is mainly because it's just the most unique caster left. The other casters that you'd see in this list and the jobs I'm not going to mention, most of their toolkits are already in creating the actual casters that we have in FF14. So it was required in order to make the jobs that we have now work properly. The Necromancer is the last unique one that we have, so the likelihood of a caster being a Necromancer in an upcoming expansion is pretty high in my opinion. Now, I was almost not going to mention the Onion Knight, but the fact that I wear an onion helm constantly and I consider myself kind of an Onion Knight, I just had to mention it, but there's also a legitimate reason I wanted to mention it as well. Now, the Onion Knight is mainly seen in Final Fantasy III. Its main thing was it could wield any weapon or armor, and it had some of the strongest damage that you could get at the end game. Now, if it would work in an MMO format, I'm not really sure. It would be nice to have a special kind of job like that would vary depending on the armor it wears. So, for example, if it was kind of like a melee class, like a knight, for example, and then it equipped kind of white mage gear, it would have the abilities of a knight and a white mage. So kind of like a support job, but kind of like mixed between the two. I think that would be something that would be rather interesting, but I think it would be too complicated into the mainstream if it was added as a job. So I think it would make an interesting limited job to be able to combine its own soul class, which is closer to a knight, and then be able to combine a secondary job in. So if it equipped black mage gear, it would gain access to black mage spells while being a knight. So could it be added? Possibly, but I don't think of anything outside of a limited job. Now, the Oracle is an interesting one. I did my research on the Oracle as well. However, from what I've seen, most of its toolkit actually went into the development of the healers that we currently have. So its main thing was it had long cooldown spells, but it had timers on the spells as well. But just from everything I've looked at, most of its toolkit is in the jobs that we have. So I don't see the Oracle ever being added to Final Fantasy XIV. I just don't think it works. There's not a place, unfortunately, for it anymore. Now, the soldier job is a rather interesting one. Unless you've played Final Fantasy Tactics, you probably wouldn't even recognize the soldier job. It's also usually called the knight job as well, so I'm using the two of them to combine together. Its main thing is it usually focuses on status affliction, so for example it would reduce armor, MP speed, etc, etc. So that's mainly the soldier's, it's a Zemo pretty much. Would the soldier be added to Final Fantasy XIV? To be honest, the fact that it focuses on status affliction to the enemies, which is something we don't really have in a job yet. I mean, we can do dots and stuff like that, but we don't really have status afflictions as a main job yet. So it would make a great support job in my opinion. It would be a melee support job, so it would be rather interesting, but it might be a bit overpowered. I mean, having the ability to status afflict, like reduced armor on a boss, reduced MP, speed for example, if you could slow it down, I think it would be far too overpowered, and then you'd have every group running a soldier or a knight, mainly because it brings that to the table and you'd be crazy not to have it. The Time Mage. The Time Mage is one of my favorite jobs from the Final Fantasy Tactics series. Now, it revolves around using magic to speed itself up, its allies, and also to slow enemies, so it revolves around sort of stuff like that, but it also uses a few caster spells as well. Would it work in Final Fantasy XIV? I don't know. I don't think so. but its time-related magic such as affecting users' casting speed in a rotation, it might be an interesting support class. If you were able to speed up your allies in order for them to cast faster, for example, it might break their rotations to high heaven, but it would be an interesting one to see. But I can't really see it as being something like that, mainly because I think it would just cause uproar with the community, mainly because it would be throwing everybody's gameplay out of whack if they had a time mage there. I mean, it sounds great being able to cast a spell constantly, like with half the speed that it usually would, but it would mess up your rotation, and rotation is pretty much everything with the jobs we have. So time mage, I don't see it working in Final Fantasy XIV. Sorry. Now, I'm bringing up warrior for one main reason. The warrior we have in Final Fantasy XIV, technically it's not really a warrior. I've already mentioned this in my last video. The warrior job that we have in FF14 is a combination of like 3 different classes. The traditional warrior, the fighter, the knight in some ways, and mostly the Berserker. Even the backstory of it is pretty much revolved around the Berserker. The Berserker went heavily into the warrior's development. Now, the main reasoning I'm bringing up the warrior is just because of the traditional warrior from the Final Fantasy series. It's a sword user. It pretty much, you'd see them all over the game. We'd see NPCs in Final Fantasy XIV that are two-handed sword users that use sword skills. They don't, like the Dark Knight, they don't use the Dark Knight's abilities or anything else. But that's the main reason I'm bringing it up. Actually, we do have the traditional warrior in FF14, but they're entirely NPCs. Would I see it being added? I'd love it if it was. It would be interesting to see a pure two-handed sword user using entirely sword skills, no magic involved. I think that would be very interesting. I say it would be added. It wouldn't be called that. It would probably be called a fighter. It could be called something else, but I think it's likely we will get a traditional two-handed sword user that is devoted purely to skill and abilities rather than using magic like the Dark Knight. It's a job mainly because we've never seen it before. It mixes the others we have, but it would be something nice. And to be honest, guys, that's everything I can think of. I can't think of any other jobs at the top of my head, pretty much, that just come to mind in terms of whether or not they could be added to FF14. But we need to understand something. The jobs that we have in FF14, as I've said earlier in the video, they're not traditional jobs. They were heavily modified in order to work in an MMO format. And the Astral Edition, for example, was mainly created for Final Fantasy XIV. Yes, it was mentioned a couple of times in a couple of other games, but it's mainly a creation for FF14. And it combines the elements of other jobs that are in the Final Fantasy universe. So it's possible we may get a brand new job that is completely new to the Final Fantasy XIV. So it could be anything. It could be a mixture of, for example, like the warrior that's on screen. It could be a mixture of the warrior, the knight, and the oracle, for all I know. It could be anything. So the Final Fantasy XIV has already proved that it's not limited by the Final Fantasy universe. It can combine the elements of other jobs that we've seen in the role-playing games and can combine them into a brand new job specifically that will work in an MMO format. And that's everything, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's the first time I've tried to do it without a script, so I apologize for mumbling and being constantly. But if you want to see more videos like this, please leave a like and a comment. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear your reviews on how I've done this video so far. If you enjoyed it and want to see more, hit that subscribe button because I'm going to have more videos incoming. Thanks for your time, guys, and I wish you all the best.